going to have, if you think about it from the Midwestern having a Thiede with a Thiede. So it is a challenge. I used to say that we were going to give honorary degrees to any of our students who could either spell or pronounce our name. And there was one day in Missouri, we were still in Missouri, where I had a student by the name of Vernon Thiede. And he came into class, and I called his name, and I said, Vernon Thiede. And he says, no ma'am, that's Thiede. And I look at him and I say, no sir, it is not. I don't know what your parents have been telling you. It's your name. It's not Thiede. You know, just
You can do what you want to with age, right?
you know, it's I actually understand it's pretty hard to figure out.
And the one thing we're going to do is get you unleashed from here. I know, right? It's, well, yes, yeah. But it's better than the two-dimensional version of what's going to be. So, another here. It's just that, it's that,
That idea of doing the, yeah, okay. Oh my goodness, this feels very loud. Yes. Thank you. Yes, otherwise I sound like the female voice of God. I can just hear myself going, Noah.
Oh, we still got a minute.
We've got a minute and a half, yay. Sure. That's beautiful. Yes, it is. Thank you. Y'all, before we're streaming, I don't know, will somebody tell us when we're streaming?
We're streaming.
Oh, we're streaming, okay. But nevertheless, you know what? I don't care. We're streaming. So what? This is also a group that belongs to us. I've been thinking next year we need to do something fun.
Hasn't this been fun?
Right. You know, and so I'm wondering if you're interested in looking at characters of Hebrew Bible who are gender fluid, right? Who are not, you know, this is unusual in a binary world. Characters who are demonstrably not really falling in spaces the way we expect them to, and what that might say about our world and about the very fluid expression of gender that would include characters like Yael, interesting character, or Joseph, who is also a very interesting character. Joseph is said, by the way, to have a womb, just in case you wondered. So think about it, and John and I will talk. That might be, you know, Or we just have to do a whole 3-session on what is funny in the Hebrew Bible, because really, what is funny? Anyway.
I think it sounds wonderful, and I think that this is this course has been wonderful, and I have learned this morning that I've been mispronouncing the rabbi's name, so I feel bad about that. Rabbi Thiede. A little harder for this hillbilly to pronounce, but I'll keep working at it. But we are so blessed to have you with us again, our concluding lesson, and thank you.
I'm so glad to be here, as you all know. So every year it's Mother's Day, and as I said last week, often my birthday, so you know, clearly there is love. Yeah, so for any of you who are still confused about how to say my name, generally I do tell people, if you're Southern, it's easy. You're just going shopping. I'm going to Harris Thiede. You're done. And for those of you who are Midwesterners and Northerners, see me after class, right? You know, do that. Okay, so we have a tough time today. We're looking at two experiences, two difficult passages that have absolutely no, there's no way to make them other than they are. And that is the rapes of Tamar, David's daughter, and David's pilagshim, often translated as concubines, though I'm not going to use that word. I'm going to use the Hebrew pilagshim, which probably means something more like second wives or secondary wives. We're not always sure, because the pilagshim operate in different ways in different settings. But I'll use the word pilagshim to avoid the idea of concubines and harems and, you know, other things that get evoked when we use that word. And as I've said throughout the series, and particularly here yet again, sexual violence in these texts is not about the women who are the victims of the sexual violence that we see. In all cases, that sexual violence is about a battle for sovereignty or power, and in these cases, even the throne. That's what we're going to see. There's one thing that there is not time to go into today, but which I write about in my second book. And I have good news. My third book has been accepted by Bloomsbury, so that one will at least be affordable. I will say a kind goodbye to Rutledge. So, the thing that I will not be able to go into today, but which I do go into in Rape Culture in the House of David, A Company of Men, is that when women are raped, often one of the things that happens is murder, right? Rape either establishes or actually escalates conflicts between men. It's an intermediary step that leads to the death of an enemy, one that is itself often sexualized and violent, and that happens also in both cases here. What matters, of course, in the story is which man is going to win and which man is going to lose. And sexual violence is part of biblical authors, male biblical authors' literary inventory, and it's an established vehicle for showing how male rivalries unfold, right? That's the vehicle, that's the point, that's the central interest of biblical writers. So what are we going to see in both narratives? So lots of trigger warnings today, lots of trigger warnings. In fact, I almost thought about just giving you a modern day example of all of the features I'm about to name, because every feature I'm about to name is contemporary in every single way. Men sharing women's bodies in both word, in imagination, and in deed. Men ogling and trapping women. Men planning rape together. Men raping within earshot of other men or in front of other men. Men raping sisters, daughters, sisters, and wives of other men. Voyeurism being integral and part and parcel of the experience. And everything, this is critical to my second book particularly, is a group effort. Friendships, counselors,
courtiers, servants, alliances, all of this is going to be part and parcel of the sexual violence that we see, and that remains the case in our time. In a manner of speaking, there is no man who rapes alone. A system is behind sexual violence, undergirds it, and makes it possible. And that is a system of hegemonic masculinity, where men have the control, again, that modern word for what we used to call patriarchy. Biblical writers will describe sexual violence as a tool, not as a crime. That's essential for us to understand. So this is how I'm going to proceed. I'm going to go through Tamar. I'm going to describe the backstory, some elements of that story. I don't have time to do all of the complex things that could be done with that story alone. Then I'll do something similar with the Pilagshim. And then, as I promised, I want to speak to the question of what do you do and how do you pray to the God of the Hebrew Bible? And so I'll conclude with that, because I think that is a very critical and important question for us all. So I want to start by saying, in the backstory, the setup for the rape of Tamar, in 6 verses, we are going to be introduced to a host of family connections among men, and we'll be introduced to characters, male characters in the family, who will be key to the experience that Tamar must undergo. This is a family affair, first and foremost, though it also has wider repercussions. Tamar is introduced immediately as the sister of Absalom. So she is not introduced as herself as the princess. She is introduced as the sister of Absalom. And there's a reason for that. There's a critical reason for that, because Amnon, who is going to be the next character that we're going to hear about, is heir to the throne, and the next good candidate is Absalom. So these two are already in a place of rivalry. And Absalom and Tamar, his full sister, descend on both sides from royalty. Their mother is a queen. So Amnon, who is not descended on both sides from royalty, may have some real concerns about the kind of threat that Absalom poses to him. We could just get into all sorts of European sagas around brothers and fights for the throne, and it would look somewhat similar. Amnon is sick because of his sister and tormented because he cannot do anything to her, right? And why can he not do anything to her? Because she's Absalom's sister. And he justifiably would fear that attacking or doing anything to Tamar would unleash a rivalry with Absalom, which he might or might not win, right? So there's honor code operating here. And Hebrew Bible, I should say, has, like all Mediterranean civilizations of this time, are working with a profoundly important honor code that is at work around male honor. Now, Amnon has a very close friend and counselor, and that is the son of David's brother, Shema. So Yonadab is also a member of the family and a nephew of King David, and he is acting as Amnon's friend. I don't have too much time to go into this, but the Hebrew here conveys the idea of a king's friend. That's an actual role in Hebrew Bible, and it is usually a role that has to do with helping the king get married. In this case, it's going to be a very different story. Like, the king gets access to sexual relationship with a woman. This is going to happen here, but on violent terms, on exceedingly violent terms. So we have Absalom, we have Amnon, we have Yonadab, and of course, Yonadab, who is an exceedingly clever fellow, sees that Amnon is sick. What's it about? Oh, prince, can I help you? And he concocts a plan. And his plan, which is on your handout on 2 Samuel 13:5, is that Amnon lie down and pretend to be ill. Of course, Amnon is already sick with what he cannot do to Tamar, so we want to think about this. And when your father comes to see you, right, so bring in King David and get David's okay, for let my sister Tamar come and give me something to eat. Let her prepare the food in front of me so I may look on and let her serve me. Now, a couple of things are going on here. I'm going to speak a lot about the subtleties here. One, remember that David has just lost a son. Bathsheba's first child has just died. So, two, finding out that the heir to his throne is ill and sick is of real concern. Kings need to be concerned about their heirs. Third, the mandate that Tamar must prepare the food in front of him so that he can look on and see is kind of a subtle hint to King David. Somebody might have been poisoning me, right? There's a hint there. Why does she have to do that in front of him? Why does he have to watch every step? So whether this is actually happening or not, subtly the message is sent to David that he has great concern and reason for great concern about his heir to the throne. Something to think about. But there's also another piece here. Jonadab is co-imagining with Amnon Tamar preparing food right in front of him as he watches and he looks on. The two of them are imagining Amnon sick in his bed while Tamar is serving him. So there's some interesting mental sharing of the image of Tamar doing a very specific kind of work, which I will get into in more detail later, right? Because of what's going to happen here. I need to speak to you first about the language that is being used here in the Hebrew, which you will not see in the English. So among other things that Jonadab says, and this is important, he uses a causative verb that Tamar should effectively come to Amnon and cause him to eat food, eat lechem, food, or bread. Now, on the face of it, you're saying, so what, Rabbi Barbara? But unfortunately, what you can't see in Hebrew is that the word lechem also can stand in as a wordplay for woman. She is to bring him the substance that will cause him to consume. Not food, but her. And it is, in fact, Tamar who will be consumed. It is not food. Amnon will never eat what she makes for him. That is only one of the word plays going on here. There's other wordplay that I go into quite extensively in that second book and also a little bit in the first book around the changing of the language, how David changes the language, Jonadab suggests certain language, Amnon suggests certain language. The way that this whole conversation plays out in the Hebrew is filled with allusions and filled with wordplay, and it is complicated and interesting that three men are trying to figure out how to phrase what exactly is going to happen to Tamar and what exactly she's supposed to be doing. But trust me when I say it's critical, and it shows that all three of them are imagining Tamar in a very specific subservient role. All three of them are thinking about her in ways that are sexually fraught. In effect, though I can't parse every piece of this for you, if you read the Hebrew, you see two men effectively co-imagining a woman in a servile position and in a sexualized position. She should cause him to consume her, right? Is absolutely a direct place where you're almost making the victim the enticer. Do you see what I'm actually, not even almost, you are making the victim the enticer in this scene. They're experiencing a fantasy together. There's a kind of bonding going on. I spend a lot of time in both the first book and to some extent the second book describing how anthropologists have looked at the ways in which men in groups will do exactly this kind of thing, where they fantasize together, where they watch specific kinds of pornography together, where they even engage in sexual behaviors together. You know, there's like a host of literature about this, right? That this can be and can function as a group male bonding experience. So some of you are going to ask, does David even know what's going on? Does he have any idea what's going on? Or is he just worried about the health of his heir? So I want to remind you that David is really familiar with the combination of food and sex. This is also something that shows up in Malignant Fraternities, where I go through a very long, extended discussion of how food and sex come up again and again as combined thematic questions in Hebrew Bible, right? Just think of Genesis 2 and 3. She eats the fruit, they discover they're naked, right? The associations between food and sex are also not confined to biblical literature, because every one of you can think back in our generation to the Tom Jones movie, right? And many other settings, all the time. Harry Met Sally, right? Where food and sex become consistently related concerns. There's all sorts of examples here, and it's not surprising. Many of the words we use around sexual activity are also words that we use around food consumption. I don't think I need to detail them for you. My husband has reminded me that in the first session, I used the word schmuck to describe David, which is kind of a bad word. And in the second session, I quoted Donald Trump using the word pussy, so I'm going to try to restrain myself right now. You know, y'all have endured a lot with me, I know. So David is very familiar with those combinations of food and sex. He himself used, and this is also a piece that I discuss in the first book, in Malignant Fraternities, in quite a great deal of amount of detail that I didn't talk to you about last week, but there's a passage where he's with Uriah, where he's drinking with Uriah, he's trying to make Uriah drunk. When he sends Uriah down to Bathsheba, go bathe your feet, you remember that's a euphemism for him to have sex with his wife, he sends a present afterwards. You know, it looks like it might have been the equivalent of wine and roses, maybe some chocolate, get them in the mood. So David himself has used food to induce sexual energy, both in Uriah by getting him a little bit drunk, or more than a little bit drunk, and in like eliciting sexualized sort of settings in the way that he sends him down to Bathsheba. So he knows how to do that. He plied Uriah with food and drink to induce him to sleep with pregnant Bathsheba, right? So what's happening here? I will say this much. It is very clear that Tamar is not important to David. That's not the issue here. No woman's welfare actually is for David. So what I called him the first session, I stand by. David himself takes women and dispenses them at will, as we will see today. So, how about Absalom? That character Absalom. You know, it's interesting how often scholars say, you know, and Absalom comes along immediately after Tamar is raped, after she's ripped her clothing, after she's put ashes on her head, she's wailed loudly. She has done something that is absolutely incredible for its courage. She has made it public. She has made it public what's happened to her. And what happens? Absalom appears like that. Oh, sorry. That was not a good idea. He appears like that. What? How? Why? Does he know that she was sent to Amnon's rooms? How is it that he happens to be there so immediately, so quickly, so right off the bat? And when he is there with her ashes on her head, like dirt on her head and a torn shirt, and crying out in grief, what is his response? First of all, he seems to know exactly what's happened, right? He says, "Has Amnon, your brother, been with you?" Nice, right? Think about that. Has Amnon, your brother, been with you? And Before she has a moment to respond, he commands her to keep quiet. Right? Amnon's your brother. Don't say anything. And don't take it too much to heart. Amnon goes and lives in his home, a desolated woman. It's the same word that is used to describe the city of Jerusalem after her entire destruction in the book of Lamentations. I just want to note that in a rape culture, men frequently collude to silence their women, when they've been assaulted by another family member, because protecting male honor and protecting reputation and family reputation is paramount. And I would be surprised if there was not at least one person in this room who knew of some woman who'd been raped by a family member and had it hushed up by other family members, because that is a chronic, consistent, and constant concern. So as always, I also want to point to all the other men that we miss, because we focus so exclusively on the specific characters, right? We focus on the way that Amnon takes her and rapes her, but we don't think about the other characters, the other male characters who are present. First, who carries the message to Tamar that she's supposed to go to Amnon's rooms and prepare food for her? Bria, in David's words, healing food, right? Not what Amnon calls it. Who's taking her? Who sends her the message and who takes her? These are likely to be men in his court. So they know that the princess is going to the private rooms of this particular prince. Just hold that thought. Secondly, Amnon is by no means alone when Tamar arrives. Neither is he alone when she prepares the pastries. And in fact, that's what he wants her to make, right? The Hebrew for that is heart cakes. She is supposed to make him pastries, not bria, not the kind of food that's supposed to heal a sick person, but pastry, mouth-watering pastry, delicacy, again, the kind of thing that you will associate with romance, heart cakes, right? Pastries she's supposed to make for him. And just after she gets there, it is clear that she is on display the entire time. She is being watched not only by Amnon, but by an assembly of male guests. How do we know this? Just after she performs her assigned tasks and sets out the food, Amnon issues an order to his servants, in the plural. I'm asking you to please hold this data here, right? In the plural. He says to his servants, effectively, have every man kicked out. I think that's on your page. Let's see. Right. No, okay, I'm afraid I may not have included that. Yep, no, 2 Samuel 13:9, there it is. She sets out the cakes, he refuses to eat, orders his servants to make every man withdraw. Kol ish, every man withdraw. Not women, not ish or isha, ish. Amnon apparently no longer wants his male guests to be watching. I want to point out they know exactly what's coming. Tamar has been on exhibit, as I've said. Who is in this room? One woman and many men. And the latter have been watching Tamar, David's most beautiful daughter. We hear that a lot about her. As she works the ingredients, as she handles the dough, as she slapped, as she kneads, possibly bent over, fashioning these into some kind of tasty and mouth-watering product. Everyone knows what the product is supposed to end in Amnon's mouth. Everyone can guess what's actually going to happen, that the heart cakes are going to be left uneaten, and that it's Tamar who's going to be consumed. There is a display here when you are kneading dough and moving dough around and baking and cooking. You know, Tom Wolfe in one of his novels, I think I quote it in *Malignant Fraternity*, says there's nothing more enticing than a beautiful woman preparing a meal. So some of his servants are told to get rid of the male guests. I want to come back to those servants in a minute. Because the first thing that happens, of course, is that Tamar, I don't have all of this passage here, but it is a heart-rending passage where she tries to convince Amnon not to rape her. Please don't rape me. She says, if you want me, then even ask King David. He'll do the right thing. He'll marry us together. There's all sorts of scholarship around, like, is it okay for a half-sister and half-brother to marry? And I won't spend some time with you here, but what I will say is that she makes every effort to stop him. She's so articulated at the beginning, and then you can actually watch in the Hebrew how her language dissolves, how she becomes less and less able to put a full sentence together. And then we also find, after she is raped, an incredible passage which I spoke to you about last year, where Amnon hates her. He hates her with a single-minded hatred. He hates her, and 6 times the word hatred is in one verse. And as I've often pointed out, we know from work I remember doing on the Serbian genocidal rape program against Muslim women in that war of the early 1990s, that Serbian men would, frankly, gang rape women, Muslim women, even to young girls, and they would then describe them as disgusting. You describe your victim as disgusting. The same thing, of course, happened writ large during the Shoah, the Holocaust, where those who were interned in the camps, particularly the Jews, were described as disgusting, odious, subhuman, not even resembling men and women, human beings at all. So that actually happens in the text. It is heart-rendingly awful. And after he rapes her, what does he do? He calls his attendant, and I think I told you this last year, the translations frequently, look on your translation, they'll say, get that woman out of my room. Hebrew doesn't say that. The Hebrew does not say that. The Hebrew says, get that thing out of my room. Get that out of my room. Tamar is no longer a human being. So here's a question for you. Is Amnon alone in the room? Do we know whether he's alone when this rape occurs? If the servant isn't in the room, he's very close by, possibly overhearing, and who, for all we know, all of these guests are close by and overhearing. The form of the command that Amnon makes to the servant is very curiously in the plural. The servant is referred to as singular, but the command is plural. And sometimes we have in Hebrew Bible a singular meant to speak to a plural, right? Like Moab will be not the name of the country, but the name of the people. So I cannot tell you for certain what is going on here, but it is certainly true that we know that a number of men were in this room before the rape. We know that many servants were asked to send those men out. So we've had a plural form before. We have a plural form again. And so I have to ask myself, did really all those servants leave the room? Or did they not? Does the text make it clear that Amnon is alone with Tamar? My answer is, it does not. And it hints, at the very least, as the possibility. I've asked myself, is the audience meant to wonder? Remember, these texts are written by men for men. Are the male audience meant to kind of fantasize here or wonder about whether Amnon was alone here? And is the biblical writer effectively inviting his male audience to populate their imagination with a number of men who are present in the planning of this rape, present during the prelude, present during the act, and present for the aftermath? Because that's an interesting fantasy and a troubling one. So I want us just to sit with the amount of men, again, that were clearly involved in this terrible event, and remind you that the eventual outcome of this particular event is that Absalom manages to arrange a nice little situation, a festival, where he can have Amnon executed. He doesn't do it himself. He has his servants do it. And he even tells them, be men, be courageous. He gets Amnon drunk at a festival where sex, drugs, and rock and roll happen at ancient festivals, right? And death and murder too, right? Remember that the first Tamar, it's at a sheep shearing festival that Judah's on his way when he can assume it's going to be party down time, that he sleeps with her. And at this festival, what happens? Amnon is murdered. All of this sexual violence ends in the murder of the heir to the throne. Now, I won't have time to talk to you about this, but also in malignant fraternities, I speculate a lot about whether we have any clues about a relationship that between Amnon and Absalom and Jonadab that does some interesting work around where Jonadab really stands and who he's really friends with. Because there's a whole set of stuff that goes on around Jonadab and how he counsels David when Amnon dies. So if you're interested in that, I'd say that's a whole nother piece to this story that's worth thinking about. Okay, let me talk to you about the Pilagshim. What is the backstory? We have, we're going from chapter 13 to chapter 15 and 16. We have Absalom in full rebellion mode here. He has been out on display, gathering his chariots and gathering his men. There's a whole set of stuff in 15 that I don't have on this sheet where Absalom is standing at the gates of Jerusalem and saying, if you want a true judge who will do right by you, who will treat you well, I'm your man. And he goes through a very interesting ritual with every Israelite who comes, every male Israelite who comes before him, that is almost a mockery of a ritual he's just gone through with David, where he's kissed David, like, you know, okay, all of you should know about kisses and how those things, what they really can mean, and what's really going on. And David does absolutely nothing about this. All of this is going on. David doesn't react in the same way that David does not react about Amnon. He does not do anything. His heir to the throne has raped one of his daughters. And even though the text claims that he was angry about it, we don't know whether he was angry about that or whether he's angry about Amnon sullying his honor, that he's now being challenged. It never says explicitly that he's angry about what happened to Tamar. Never. So there he does nothing. He lets Absalom do his dirty work, and Amnon is killed. And here again, one son, absolutely over the top. Absalom even goes to David, like you couldn't hint any more strongly than Absalom does. He goes to David and says, oh, Dad, I have a vow. I have to go to Hebron and fulfill my vow. Where was David crowned? Hebron. And Absalom goes, and guess what? Who gets crowned? He tells his servants, go out, tell everybody, I was crowned in Hebron. Only after a messenger comes to David in Jerusalem and says, basically, all of Israel is on Absalom's side, you are in trouble, dude, does David react. And how does he react? This is on the other side of your handout. I didn't have quite the room for Hebrew, but if you read through Samuel 15, 14 through 18, oh my goodness, we've got to run. We've got to run for it. We have to get away quickly, right? And the king leaves, followed by his entire household, except for the 10 Pilagshim, whom the king left to mind the palace. The word used there is shamar, to protect, to keep the palace, like these concubines are going to do it. The king leaves, followed by his entire household, all the people, all of his followers, and then they get named. There are even children that come with, as you'll see in that verse. Everybody goes with David, but these 10 women, everybody goes. And the Hebrew over and over is emphasizing this by the use of the word kol, which means all or every. Kol, his household, kol, his followers, all the parasites, whoever it is, all. My God, it's driven into your brain. Everybody goes with David, but not these 10 women. He leaves those Pilagshim entirely to the mercy of Absalom and entirely to the mercy of Absalom's men. And I remind you that in 2 Samuel 12, the prophet Nathan says to David that the Israelite deity, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, has said, the sword will never depart from your house after what you've done to Uriah, right? The sword will never depart from your house. And I myself, you did this thing in the darkness. And of course he's referring to the killing of Uriah, not Bathsheba, which was perfectly public. Remember that? But the killing of Uriah is done under cover of darkness. And because you did this thing under cover of darkness, the sword will never leave your house. I myself am going to take your women, and another man is going to lay with them in the full light of day. Go look it up. It's in 2 Samuel 12 at the very end of the chapter. So the deity says, I'm going to take your women, and they are going to effectively be used by another man. That's going to be your punishment. And that, in fact, is exactly what happens, which might make you wonder what kind of deity this is. And might make you wonder why David is just leaving them behind. Is he propitiating the deity because he knows what's coming? He's already been told, might as well happen to these women. It's another planned rape. Just like Jonadab and Amnon planned the rape of Tamar, we have another planned rape. Achitophel is a Gilonite. Note the connections here. He is father to Eliam. Anybody remember who Eliam is? Bathsheba's father. Achitophel is Bathsheba's grandfather. And he is now engaged in going over to the other side with Absalom and preparing and helping Absalom totally humiliate his father, the king, who once humiliated his family. Or, as I will give her credit for this, Tivka Frymer-Kinsky, a great biblical scholar, wrote decades ago, so this isn't original to me, revenge is a dish best served cold. Right? He's a member of David's 30 mighty men, and he has pragmatic considerations, and he knows that when Absalom rapes David's women, all of Israel, all the Israelite men, all of Israel refers to the men, will know that there can never be a reconciliation between the father and son, right? This is an insult to David's honor that is extreme. And so he says in this verse, when Absalom asks Achitophel for advice, Achitophel, by the way, is a counselor whose advice is so well respected that there's a phrase in Bible that says what Achitophel said kind of like came from God. Remember who it was that said that these women were going to be raped by another man? Achitophel, God's servant here. Achitophel says to Absalom, have intercourse. What a lovely way to say it. It literally says, go into them. Go into them. Those he left to mind the palace. When all Israel hears that you have dared the wrath of your father, all who support you will be encouraged, right? Because you will stink. He says you will stink to David. That's the literal word that he uses in one of these verses in 2 Samuel 16:21. He says, you will stick to David. If all Israel knows again that there can be no reconciliation, Achitophel can at least know that everybody's going to fight even harder for Absalom, because now they have no choice. Right? Achitophel has made that impossible. There can be no reconciliation here. And that way, Achitophel actually strengthens his side's ability to fight for the throne. Right? Everybody has to stand as one man. And what happens? Absalom indeed violates these women, le'enei kol Yisrael, before the eyes of all Israel. Again, the men. Who is all Israel in this context? Absalom's advisors and counselors, his generals, his servants, his troops, his courtiers. A mass of men is complicit, is acting as bystanders. Absalom exhibits an uber-virility by raping no fewer than 10 women before all these men. Again, we have that voyeurism. The sex is again heard, even watched. Again, a male biblical audience is given a scene to imagine pornographic action they can imagine vicariously. Once again, I want to tell you this is important. The modern reader who does not name this narrative for what it is, which is a story of licensed violation of women witnessed by a crowd of men, becomes themselves an accomplice and a bystander and even potentially a colluder. If we read this and do not name it, we are effectively permitting it to stand. Rape in the house of David is made permissible by, as I write in that second book, as is in the title, a company of men. So what have we seen altogether? And then I'll get to Mary's question. The biblical authors write scenes of men engaged in sex talk, in fantasy, in indecent exposure, as we've seen from David and Michal, of themselves and their women, and in sexual violence. They picture men picturing what other men do to women. They describe men listening and watching. These texts are composed by men for men, and they invite voyeurism as a way to reinforce biblical hegemonic masculinity and to cement its rape culture. And even modern readers are cast into the role of voyeurs by these texts. I want to say one thing before I talk about conclusions. William Dever, a really amazing archaeologist, describes the Hebrew Bible as a minority report. He says this was written by a small elite group of men for men, and you know what? It doesn't really correspond a lot of the time to what we discover in the archaeological record, including around and about what women seem to have been doing. If it ever, at any point, you want to have a series on what does the archaeological record tell us about these people's lives, let me know, because it's a different story. Now, it's probably not a matriarch where women are free and happy and being able to do whatever they want, but we don't necessarily have these texts playing out in the ways we would expect in the archaeological record. So I want to acknowledge that. And nevertheless, these texts have become sacred texts for how many millions and billions of people? And as a result, we are responsible. So, what do we do with toxic texts? I told you last week, and even the week before, I think, we pray to an interpreted God. Every one of us does that. To pray to the deity who hands women from one man to another to be raped, who engages in explosive and violent behavior, is not in our interest, and none of us do it. We might as well pray to Zeus, who was a fantastic rapist, right? None of you would pray to Zeus, would you? I doubt it. So you're not actually praying to that God. I promise you, you are not praying to that deity. Cherry picking, however, and avoiding is not, in my mind, a healthy way to respond to toxic masculinity in these texts. I think we need to do this more honestly. These toxic texts are there and they will not go away. I like to believe that the God I pray to understands that every effort I make to call out these texts and say this is wrong and it is dangerous and it is toxic is in God's service, is in the service of tikkun, of healing. That God, I think, endorses my efforts and understands that these texts are flawed and come from a particular culture, which is not unlike ours, which has valorized and accepted male violence. I want to tell you about a Talmudic text, Bava Metzia. In this Talmudic text, there's a whole lot of argument around an oven. Is the oven usable? Is it not usable? And there's one rabbi who is a mystical rabbi, and he says, it's usable. And the other rabbis say, well, prove it. And he says, okay, I'll make that carob tree get up and walk to another place. And he does. Carob tree gets up, walks to another place. The other rabbis go, okay, how is that supposed to be proved? Come on, really? And then he says, all right, I'll make the water in the aqueducts go the other direction, because God supports me, and this is proof. And the water in the aqueducts goes the other direction, and the other rabbis go, what? Come on. And then he says, the walls of the study hall shall fall. Hopefully they're not inside the study hall. I never have figured that out. And the walls start leaning. And then the other rabbis are hoping they will stop, and they do. They stop while they're leaning. And then a bat kol, a voice of God, comes and says, Rabbi Eliezer is right. The stove is pure. And the other rabbis protest, and they say, no, hold on just a minute. You, God, gave us these texts, and you gave them to us, and once you gave them to us, it is now our responsibility to interpret them and to understand whether the stove can be used or not used. It's our job. The text is now on earth. We have to grapple with it. We have to struggle with it. We have to fight with it. And much later, one of these rabbis meets up with the prophet Elijah and says, just curious, how did God react to that? And Elijah says, God laughed and said, my children have bested me. My children have bested me. That's a God I can pray to. A God who insists that it is my responsibility and my right to do the work of how I must read these texts and how I must name what is toxic in them. I do that, and I hope we can do that, with a mind towards saying, this work could help us make the world a healthier place, a safer place, and not just for women, but for all human beings. So when you ask me, how do I pray? I say, look, I appreciate that these are sacred texts, and I must wrestle with them. I am Israel. I am a God wrestler. That's what that word means. I'm someone who struggles with God. And I have to believe that the God that I pray to, who is glimmering in beautiful places in these texts, is saying, this is me, and this is who I want you to see as the backer of everything you do. We are all God's hands. We are all Godding in this world. May we do that with grace, with care, with attentiveness, and with the willingness to explore in both our traditions anything that can harm or hurt another human being. Because after all, the central mandate in both traditions is about love. Is it not? As we say in Hebrew, dibarti, I'm done. Until next year, of course.
I have been entrusted with the mic, and I'm sure Barbara will entertain questions.
I will.
And so if you'll indicate that you have one, I will bring you the mic.
And also I will say that I understand, John told me that he wanted to buy one of these for your library. So, if you don't want to spend the exorbitant amount of money on this, then you'll have it in your library. Like use libraries. Libraries makes things so much more affordable. Yes, sir.
I have about 45 questions, but
I have an email address.
well, you just answered a couple of them.
Okay.
How did these get put in text? They were for a very small audience. Are there any translations of the Bible that would be accessible to us, or commentaries or interpretations that deal with this besides your books?
So, I don't have it yet, but am planning to order it. So what I will do is look and see if this does the work that I would want it to do, and then I'll email John. There is a woman's translation / commentary of the Torah, right? I think it's just the first 5 books of Moses. I don't think it's the entire Hebrew Bible, but let me investigate that piece. Certainly, there is an incredible amount of scholarly work that's been done on these books, but in terms of a commentary that is purely focused all the way through, start to finish, on issues of gender, not so much. There are books. There's a book called Torah Queries, which actually deals with addressing queer personalities or queer questions. And I've got a laundry list of other books besides mine that you could read. But let me get back to you about that particular commentary. Because boy, it sounds like we need one, doesn't it?
Second question.
Of 45, the rest of you are
No, I'm not going to 45, I'm going to 2. What about the translators, the King James translators, modern translators? Is there much awareness of this, or are they sanitizing it in English for us, or are they oblivious to a lot of this subtlety?
So I would say that a certain amount of sanitizing goes on, and I want to own this in not just Christian translations, but also in Jewish ones, right? I tend to see a little bit more reluctance to deal with things in Christian traditions, but not always, not always. Like sometimes I'll compare it to, I'll compare the Jewish Publication Society to the NRS, and I'll go, NRS has got that one better. So there are complicated issues here, one of which is our own understanding of what words mean actually changes. So the word molest, which comes up in Hebrew Bible in the book of Ruth, where Boaz says to one of his servants, go to Ruth and tell her, I'm going to make sure, you might even say it to her herself, I'd have to go look at the verse, that no one will molest you, right? That none of the men in the field will molest you. And for a long time, people, understood this word molest, but is that bother her? Or is that invasively getting physical with her? And it took a long time for those even who are linguistically inclined to be able, now we have the technology to do things we didn't used to do, or have the technology to do, which is to look for exactly the phrase plus the preposition on the next, I'm going to get complicated here, on the next word, but if this particular word molest is used with this particular preposition, every time it shows up, there's physical violence going on. Okay, so do we now understand that molest is a more physically kind of sense than just being bothered? So part of this is how we ourselves change in terms of our understanding of potential English equivalents, and our own willingness now to hear the word molest and to think that that might be more than just a little bit of bothering is also a thing. If you look at English dictionaries, like what molest referred to and how it's defined in a dictionary 100 years ago will be different than it is now, because we are more conscious of molestation as a different kind of thing, sexualized in nature. So there's that. Okay, so is there sanitizing going on? Sure, always. There's all sorts of pieces here. It is also, have any of you ever translated seriously? Because I can tell you I have. In my early years, Ralph and I used to translate a peace journal from German to English. And if you have not done that work and know how difficult it is to get one language into another, and figure out which the right word is to choose, it is hard. So sometimes the translation is, it's a legitimate one. It's just not really sensitive to the potential sexualized nuances. I think you really have to have a conscious awareness also as a translator of the premises behind the writers. And I'm not sure that translators are always as aware of that as scholars are. So that's a third issue. Yeah, this is so complicated, Bill.
And for your third question, or someone else's?
Yeah, right. Can we skip to 45?
We know about Absalom, but he always comes across in the Christian Bible or King James Version as being the bad guy. And he certainly has flaws. What's your take on him as his character?
As a character. Yeah. He dies, I mentioned that rape leads to murder after the Pilagshim are raped. Eventually Joab takes Absalom out and, contrary to David's wish, does so in a highly awful way. Absalom's hair gets caught in a tree, and Joab repeatedly, the text says, pierces and pierces and pierces him again. It's a highly sexualized kind of image of what's going on. Absalom, I think, is... All right, so on the one hand, is he any better a character than David? That's where I really want to start, right? David kills tens of thousands of human beings, and sometimes these are women and children. We never fault him for that. He's still the good guy. He's still the great king, right? He takes women willy-nilly from other men and has them killed. We don't seem to fault him much for that. If I'm comparing Absalom to David, I'd say Absalom is a chip off the old block. That's what I would say. Like father, like son. I just also want to notice something in terms of gender. So we've had 3 men, and I'm wondering if the women have anything to say here. And because in my classes I frequently have to say, let's make sure that women also have space to talk to. Which isn't to say that all these questions aren't wonderful, but the women in the audience, be shy on your own time is my advice. Go ahead.
The discussion about Tamar preparing food for Amon's viewing pleasure, I had read this morning and would be interested in your reaction to this. A theologian whom I don't know, and now I just lost it here. Hold on, comes back. You prepare a table before me, from the 23rd Psalm, is a depiction of a male engaging in activities that in David's culture would have been done by a woman.
There are moments in Hebrew Bible where we do see men preparing food. So that does happen. It's very, very rare. But Lot prepares food for his angelic guests. So it's not impossible to see that. I think what's interesting here is because there's so much sexual language in the whole issue about what she's supposed to prepare and how she's supposed to do that in front of him, and the way that we have that male audience, there's a whole, that I can only say to you, in the Hebrew, it's pretty clear that this is a display going on. And if anybody has ever kneaded bread dough, have any of you ever done that? I don't think I need to say anything more. Oh, it's another man.
This is the discrimination question
here. Let me first find out, is there a single woman in here with a question? Or are they just, all right.
The kingmaker in all of this is Joab. Now I guess after Absalom is killed, Solomon is then set up to be the next king. Is there any connection there, do you think?
Is there a connection between
Joab
Absalom being...
and Solomon?
Joab and Solomon, yeah. The connection is that David tells Solomon to get rid of Joab. Right? that's like one of the last things that David does on his deathbed is say, take care of that one, get him out. Joab here utterly flaunts David's wishes about what to do with Joab, has an incredible scene with David around this, where he says to David, you know, this guy was rebelling against you, and you are effectively making everybody who fought on your side, you know, in this place of living with your lack of gratitude that they helped you hold on to the throne. It's wrong what you're doing. And, you know, again, David probably in that episode, and given the way Joab kills Absalom, sees him as fundamentally dangerous to any of his future offspring. So again, when he put Solomon on the throne, one of his big pieces of advice is take care of Joab. He's gotten a little too big for his boots.
I think we're going to have to call this off unless there is a female person who wishes to ask a question.
Well, I mean, it can also be a reaction rather than a question, right?
A reaction. We'll take reaction.
Oh, we've got one. Hallelujah.
Well, I guess, first of all, I found it very interesting when you referred to the anthropologist who said, you know, basically, our research, our studies suggest that this isn't how everybody lived. This is pretty much confined to a small group.
Yeah, let me be really careful about
yeah.
that. Yeah. Okay. Actually, do you have a question there, or should I just expound a
Well,
little more?
and I guess just extrapolating on from that, this isn't just peculiar. The subjugation and objectifying of women is not peculiar just in Christianity and in Judaism.
Oh, God.
I think it you know, extends to most world religions. And I guess that's interesting. Where does that come from? Why is that?
Why is it that women are so easily subjugated in general? Is that the
Well,
question?
just the domination by men seems to, you know, it's a common thread.
Right. Well, it certainly does help that up until very recently, women had no control over their bodies. And the question about how much control they have now is up for grabs. But the fact that men, in fact, are never, for any length of time, biologically required to have their body shared with another human being and then to take care of that other human being in order to raise it, does already put women in an ancient period and even up till recent time in a position that is already starting them tied to reproduction and child rearing in ways that in binary terms men generally aren't, though I do want to say there are cultures in the world that don't necessarily treat childbearing and child rearing as a female domain. But many, 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 many cultures do. And I think that is part of the problem, along with the fact that in ancient cultures, you know, what kind of work is getting done in order to create systems of defense, right? That too is going to be a piece of this. Do I think that women are naturally subservient to men? You know, by nature, are we born into that place? Well, first of all, I want to say that gender itself, I'm already speaking in very binary sorts of terms, and gender isn't that binary. It isn't as binary as I'm making it out to be. So I would say that this whole question is complicated and worth another 3 sessions. So let's do it. Maybe next year with the whole gender issue.
And we need to thank Rabbi Barbara for 3 wonderful weeks and look forward to next year.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You all stay well and healthy. Take care of yourselves. I expect to see everybody back in this room, whether it is my birthday next year or not.